Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly chilling journey back to the heart of ancient Greece, not to marvel at philosophers or democratic ideals, but to plunge headfirst into one of history's most terrifying outbreaks, the Plague of Athens. You're about to experience what it was like to live through, and perhaps desperately try to survive. A horrifying plague in a crowded, besieged city. Forget everything you know about modern medicine and sanitation. This was a nightmare, without escape, where death stalked every street and entered every home. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive the first week, let alone the entire ordeal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Now? Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing in the bustling, yet increasingly tense, city of Athens, circa 430 BCE. The Peloponnesian War is raging, and you, like countless others from the surrounding Attic countryside, have been forced to retreat within the city's formidable long walls for protection against the Spartan invaders. The city is overcrowded. Its usual vibrant energy now a suffocating press of humanity. The air, typically fresh with the scent of olive groves and sea breeze, is now thick with the smell of too many bodies, too much waste, and an unsettling undercurrent of fear. Then it begins, not with a bang, but with an insidious whisper that quickly turns into a scream. The first reports are vague, disquieting rumors of a strange, virulent disease striking down people in Piraeus, the city's port. You hear whispers of extreme fever, burning eyes, and an unbearable thirst. But Athens is a large city, a hub of trade and ideas. Surely it won't reach you? You try to reassure yourself, but a cold knot forms in your stomach. The plague, as described by the historian Thucydides, who himself contracted and survived it, was unlike anything the Athenians had ever seen. It was fast, brutal, and seemingly indiscriminate. The initial symptoms were terrifyingly sudden. You would feel an intense burning sensation in your head. Your eyes would turn red and inflamed, and a painful, foul-smelling breath would escape your mouth. Imagine your head feeling like it's on fire, your vision blurring, and every breath tasting of decay. It truly sucked to wake up feeling fine and then be hit by such an immediate, visceral horror. As the disease progressed, your throat would become raw and hoarse, a violent cough racking your chest. You'd experience vomiting of bile and an unbearable retching that offered no relief. The skin, initially flushed, would break out in reddish, livid pustules and ulcers, covering your body in an agonizing, unsightly rash. This wasn't just discomfort, it was a visible, agonizing transformation, turning your body into a landscape of disease. The internal burning, Thucydides recounts, was so intense that many victims could not bear even the lightest linen on their bodies and yearned for nothing but cold water, often throwing themselves into public fountains in desperation. Imagine a thirst so profound that it overrides all reason, driving you to dangerous, futile acts. This wasn't just a fever, it was an internal inferno that consumed you from within. The terrifying speed of its onset and progression was one of its most disturbing characteristics. Many victims succumbed within 7 to 9 days, their bodies racked by fever and agonizing symptoms. For those who survived longer, the disease often settled in the bowels, causing severe diarrhea or attack the extremities, leading to gangrene and loss of fingers or toes. Some survivors even suffered from blindness or memory loss, a grim reminder of the plague's lasting horrifying legacy. This rapid onset and progression meant there was little time for reflection, or even for proper goodbyes. One day, a neighbor is healthy, the next, they are writhing in agony, and the day after, they are gone. The sheer speed of death created an atmosphere of pervasive terror, as you never knew who would be next, or how quickly their demise would come. This wasn't just a widespread illness, it was a constant, personal threat lurking just beneath the surface of daily life. One common misconception is that the Plague of Athens was the bubonic plague, while similar in its devastating effects. Modern historians still debate its exact identity. Theories range from typhus, smallpox, or even a form of Ebola-like hemorrhagic fever. The symptoms described by Thucydides don't perfectly match any single known disease, suggesting it might have been a unique strain or a combination of pathogens. Historians meticulously analyze Thucydides' accounts, comparing them to modern medical knowledge. But the true identity of the Athenian plague remains a subject of ongoing academic debate. So, as the first horrifying symptoms begin to manifest in Athens, you realize that you are caught in a nightmare, a struggle for survival against an unknown, merciless enemy. The initial onset is a visceral, agonizing assault on your body, and the speed of its progression leaves you with little hope. Only the chilling certainty that the true horrors have just begun. As the horrifying symptoms of the plague grip Athens, your initial terror quickly gives way to a profound sense of helplessness. The city, once a beacon of intellectual prowess and civic order, rapidly descends into chaos. Medical knowledge, the very foundation of Greek wisdom, proves utterly useless in the face of this unprecedented pestilence, making your survival attempt truly horrifying. Imagine seeking help. You might turn to the city's physicians, those learned men who studied the humors and the balance of the body. They would approach your fevered, pustule-covered body with caution, perhaps prescribing herbal remedies, bloodletting, or various poultices. But these treatments, based on limited understanding, would be utterly ineffective. The doctors themselves, exposed to the contagion, would be among the first to fall, leaving the sick without even rudimentary care. The sight of a renowned healer succumbing to the very disease they tried to cure would send a chilling message: no one is safe. And no one has answers? It truly sucked when your best hope was just another victim. The medical treatises of the time, even those by the likes of Hippocrates, though he predated this specific plague, offered little practical guidance for such a virulent and unknown disease. They understood symptoms, but not causation or contagion. Their remedies were based on balancing the body's internal fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So if you were burning with fever, a doctor might try to cool you by bleeding you or by administering emetics to induce vomiting, believing it would expel the bad humors. These interventions, far from helping, often weakened already compromised bodies, accelerating their decline. With the physicians dying or fleeing, the sick were left to the care of their loved ones. Imagine your family, desperately trying to ease your suffering, but having no idea how to stop the progression of the disease. They might offer you cold water, try to cool your burning skin, or simply sit by your side, waiting for the inevitable. The fear of contagion, however, would begin to erode even these deepest bonds. People would become reluctant to approach the sick, abandoning friends and family members, leaving them to die alone. The social fabric that held Athenian society together was beginning to unravel under the relentless pressure of death. The lack of sanitation in an overcrowded, besieged city further exacerbated the crisis. Athens was not equipped to handle such a massive influx of people. Public fountains, which served as common water sources, would become vectors for disease. Waste disposal systems, rudimentary at best, would be completely overwhelmed. The streets, already teeming with people, would become choked with the sick, the dying, and the dead, creating a fetid environment ripe for further contagion. Imagine the stench, the flies, the sheer squalor surrounding you, adding to the horror. One common historical misconception is that ancient societies had a complete disregard for cleanliness, while their understanding of germ theory was non-existent. The Greeks, like the Egyptians, did value personal hygiene and public health measures to some extent. However, a plague of this magnitude simply overwhelmed any existing infrastructure or traditional practices. The sheer volume of sick and dead bodies rendered all their usual attempts at cleanliness utterly futile. Historians still meticulously study the descriptions of the plague's spread and its environmental factors to understand the complex interplay of overcrowding, sanitation, and disease transmission in ancient urban centers. Furthermore, the very nature of the Peloponnesian War, which had forced people into the confined space of Athens, made escape impossible for most. The Spartans had besieged the city, cutting off access to the countryside. You were trapped within the walls, with no possibility of fleeing the growing pestilence. This sense of being caged, with death stalking every alleyway, added a terrifying psychological dimension to the physical suffering. Your city, your sanctuary, had become your prison. So, as the plague tightened its grip on Athens, you witnessed the horrifying impotence of ancient medicine and the rapid degradation of urban life. Every attempted remedy was a shot in the dark, every shared space a risk, and every day brought new levels of despair. Survival was becoming less about treatment and more about a desperate, individual gamble against an invisible, merciless enemy that mocked all human efforts. As the terrifying grip of the plague tightens around Athens, claiming lives with chilling speed, your experience as a survivor takes an even darker turn with the collapse of basic funerary rites. The sheer volume of the dead overwhelms the city's capacity for respectful burial, leading to practices that are nothing short of horrifying. The dead, once honored with solemn ceremonies, are now treated with a brutal, desperate expediency. Imagine the traditional Greek funeral, a period of mourning, the careful washing and shrouding of the body, a lamentation, and then a respectful procession to the family tomb outside the city walls. This was a sacred duty, essential for the deceased to find peace in the afterlife. But now, with hundreds, then thousands, dying each day, those cherished traditions crumble. The living are too few, too sick, and too terrified to perform them. It truly sucked to see death lose all dignity. The first horrifying signs appear in the streets. Bodies, fevered and pustule-covered, begin to pile up in homes, in alleyways, and even in public squares. Those who dare to approach the dead quickly succumb themselves. The air grows heavy with the stench of decay, a nauseating testament to the plague's relentless efficiency. This isn't just a grim sight. It's a sensory assault, a constant reminder of the death surrounding you. With traditional burials impossible, the Athenians resort to mass graves. Imagine the scene pits dug hastily, just outside the city walls or in any available open space. Bodies, often unwashed, unclothed, and unceremoniously dumped, are thrown into these pits, layer upon layer, sometimes still twitching with the last spasms of life. There's no time for individual reverence, no proper shroud, no farewell prayers. The dead are simply raw material for the earth, their identities stripped away by the sheer scale of the catastrophe. Thucydides vividly describes this breakdown. The dead lay unburied in piles, or were carried off to be buried by those who had already recovered, who were then often seized by the disease themselves. He recounts how some, in their desperation and fear, would even appropriate pyres intended for others' bodies, igniting them and dumping their own dead on top. This wasn't malice. It was a testament to the sheer panic and overwhelmed state of the living, desperate to dispose of the dead before they themselves succumbed. This chaotic, undignified disposal of bodies would have been deeply shocking to a culture that placed such importance on proper burial. This undignified treatment of the dead had profound psychological effects on the living. When death loses its sanctity, when bodies are treated like refuse, it erodes the very foundations of morality and social order. The fear of death becomes so overwhelming that it eclipses all other concerns, including religious piety and traditional customs. The living become hardened, detached, watching the procession of death with a grim apathy born of constant exposure. One particularly disturbing detail, not explicitly stated by Thucydides but inferred by historians, is the potential for cannibalism or other extreme acts in the utter desperation that might have arisen during the worst phases of the plague. Although definitive evidence is scarce, while likely rare, the breakdown of societal norms could push individuals to unimaginable extremes to survive. Historians still meticulously examine skeletal remains from mass graves, looking for forensic evidence that might shed light on the full extent of this societal breakdown, though much remains unconfirmed due to the destructive nature of mass burials. The constant exposure to unburied bodies and unsanitary burial practices also contributed to the spread of the disease. While the primary mode of transmission was person to person, the contaminated environment, the flies, and the constant handling of infected corpses would undoubtedly have exacerbated the crisis. The attempts to manage the dead, though born of necessity, inadvertently turned the city into a vast, open graveyard, further fueling the epidemic. So, as the Plague of Athens reached its terrifying peak, you witnessed the horrifying spectacle of death stripped of all dignity. The traditional rites collapsed under the weight of sheer numbers, leading to mass burials that turned Athens into a city of the dead, where bodies piled up and respect became a forgotten luxury. This brutal reality of death without honor was a profound and lasting trauma for those who survived, cementing the horrifying memory of the plague in their minds forever. As the Plague of Athens ravaged your city, turning every street into a macabre procession and every home into a potential tomb, you witnessed something perhaps even more horrifying than the physical symptoms or the undignified burials: the complete collapse of law and order, and the disintegration of Athenian society, the bonds that held people together. The very fabric of civilization began to unravel under the relentless pressure of fear and death. This societal breakdown made your struggle to survive truly horrifying. Imagine the bustling agora, once the heart of Athenian democracy, now a silent, desolate space. The courts, where justice was dispensed, would fall quiet. The assembly, where citizens debated the future of their city, would cease to meet, with death omnipresent and seemingly arbitrary. The fear of punishment by human law, or even divine retribution, evaporated. Why adhere to rules when tomorrow might never come? It truly sucked when morality became a casualty of disease. Thucydides, our grim guide, vividly describes this moral decay, for since the plague was too much for them, men, not knowing what was to happen next, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. This meant a shocking surge in lawlessness and moral depravity. People who had once been pious and respectful citizens would now brazenly disregard laws. Property theft became rampant. People would break into homes of the sick and dying, not to help, but to loot their belongings, knowing there would be no repercussions. Funerals, once sacred, became opportunities for plunder, with people robbing bodies or even pyres. The most disturbing aspect of this breakdown was the erosion of human empathy and compassion. As the disease spread, people became increasingly reluctant to care for the sick, even their own family members. The fear of contagion was so profound that even strong familial bonds dissolved. You might see a sick parent abandoned by their children, a dying spouse left alone in their bed, simply because no one dared to risk their own life, Thucydides states. The most terrible thing of all was the despair which seized anyone who felt sick, because they gave themselves up for lost from the moment they contracted the disease. This despair, coupled with the terror of infection, led to widespread abandonment of the afflicted. This breakdown also affected the practice of religion. Temples, once centers of communal worship and hope, became places where people dared to commit sacrilege, with no apparent divine intervention stopping the plague. Many lost faith in the gods. Why offer sacrifices or pray when the gods seem to have abandoned them? People would enter temples and openly commit acts of impiety, believing that if justice was coming, it would come for everyone equally, regardless of their actions. The very concept of justice withered. With magistrates dying and courts closed, there was no one to enforce laws or hold wrongdoers accountable. This created a free-for-all, where personal gain, however illicit, became the only guiding principle. The social contract, the implicit agreement that bound Athenians together, dissolved under the immense pressure of survival. One common historical misconception is that ancient societies were inherently more barbaric than modern ones. While their legal systems differed, ancient Greece, particularly Athens, had a sophisticated, if flawed, system of law and justice. The plague didn't reveal an inherent barbarism. It demonstrated how quickly even advanced societies can unravel when faced with an existential threat that destroys the perceived value of life and the fear of consequences. Historians still debate the extent of this moral collapse, often relying on Thucydides' dramatic account, which might have emphasized the most extreme examples. Furthermore, the overcrowding within the long walls meant that there was simply nowhere to escape this moral disintegration. You were constantly surrounded by death, despair, and depravity. Forced to witness humanity at its worst, this constant exposure to suffering and lawlessness would leave an indelible mark on your psyche, stripping away your illusions about human nature and the stability of your society. So, as the plague tore through Athens, it didn't just claim lives, it destroyed the very soul of the city. The collapse of law and order, the abandonment of piety, and the horrifying erosion of human compassion made your struggle to survive a living nightmare, where the lines between good and evil, civility and savagery, became terrifyingly blurred. As the plague continued its relentless assault on Athens, decimating the population and dissolving the very fabric of society, you, as a survivor, would inevitably confront the profound and horrifying psychological impact of living through such an apocalypse. This wasn't just about physical suffering, it was about the insidious erosion of hope, the normalization of death, and the chilling indifference that fear bred in the hearts of men Imagine waking up each day to the grim reality. The cheerful chatter of children playing in the streets is replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sporadic cries of the sick or the mournful wails for the dead. The vibrant city you knew, a hub of culture and intellectual life, has transformed into a vast charnel house. Every breath you take, every person you see, is a reminder of the invisible enemy lurking everywhere. This pervasive atmosphere of death and despair would settle upon your soul, heavy and suffocating. It truly sucked to have hope become a luxury. Thucydides provides a chilling account of this psychological toll. The most terrible thing of all was the despair which seized anyone who felt sick, because they gave themselves up for lost from the moment they contracted the disease, and died the more readily on that account. This describes a phenomenon known as psychological surrender. When faced with an overwhelming and seemingly incurable threat, many simply lost the will to live. Their minds, ravaged by terror and hopelessness, essentially gave up, accelerating their physical demise. Imagine watching a loved one, or even yourself, simply losing the desire to fight, succumbing not just to the disease, but to the crushing weight of despair. The constant exposure to death, especially the undignified mass burials we discussed earlier, would lead to a chilling desensitization. The human mind, in an attempt to cope with the unimaginable horror, would slowly become indifferent to suffering. The sight of unburied bodies, once shocking, would become mundane. The cries of the dying, once heartbreaking, would become background noise. This isn't coldness, it's a defense mechanism, a brutal way for the psyche to protect itself from complete collapse. But it came at a terrible cost, the erosion of empathy and the loss of what makes us truly human. Fear became the overriding emotion, dictating every action: fear of contagion, fear of abandonment, fear of a painful, undignified death. This fear fractured social bonds, turning neighbors into wary strangers and even severing familial ties. People became isolated, distrustful, focusing solely on their own desperate survival. The communal spirit that once defined Athenian society withered under the immense pressure. Adding to this despair was the religious crisis. The Athenians were a deeply religious people, believing in the power and intervention of their gods. But as the plague raged, seemingly untouched by prayers, sacrifices, or prophecies, faith began to crumble. Why would the gods abandon them in their hour of greatest need? Temples, once sanctuaries, became places of open impiety, where people dared to commit sacrilege, believing that if divine justice was coming, it would spare no one. The spiritual void, this feeling of abandonment by the divine, intensified the profound sense of hopelessness. It really sucked when even the gods abandoned you. One common historical misconception is that ancient people were entirely fatalistic in the face of disease. While they certainly believed in fate and divine will, Thucydides' account clearly shows immense human struggle, desperate attempts to survive, and profound psychological suffering. Rather than passive acceptance, the very act of documenting the plague, as Thucydides did, implies a search for understanding and meaning, not just resignation. Historians continue to analyze ancient texts and archaeological finds for evidence of coping mechanisms, both positive and negative, that emerge during such widespread crises, looking for the nuances of human response beyond simple fatalism. The sheer unpredictability of the plague also contributed to the psychological torment. There was no pattern, no identifiable cause, no effective cure. One person might die, while their caregiver, constantly exposed, might inexplicably survive. This randomness fostered a sense of futility and meaninglessness. Why strive for virtue? Why follow laws when death could strike anyone at any time? Regardless of their actions, this erosion of consequence further fueled the societal breakdown, creating a world where desperate survival, by any means necessary, became the only guiding principle. So, as you struggled through the Plague of Athens, the horrifying psychological impact became almost as devastating as the physical disease itself. Your mind was subjected to a relentless assault of despair, desensitization, and spiritual abandonment, leaving an indelible scar that would haunt the survivors and irrevocably change the soul of Athens forever. As the horrifying psychological toll of the plague settled over Athens, turning despair into indifference, you, as one of the terrified survivors, would quickly realize that a different, perhaps counterintuitive, strategy was your only true hope: isolation. In a city where social bonds were disintegrating and every gathering was a death trap, retreating from the communal life became a desperate, often lonely, gamble for survival. This forced isolation, while potentially life-saving, made your experience of the plague even more horrifying. Imagine the constant dilemma: your instincts, honed by a lifetime in a tightly knit polis, would urge you to seek comfort in numbers, to mourn with neighbors, to care for the sick. But every interaction was a roll of the dice. You watched as those who nobly tended to the sick quickly succumbed themselves. Doctors died, priests died, family members, trying to help, died. The chilling reality set in compassion was a death sentence. It truly sucked when kindness became a danger. So you would retreat. Perhaps you lived in a part of the city that was less densely populated, or you had a small, isolated household. You would minimize your contact with others. No more visits to the agora, no more gathering at the public fountains. You would draw inward, sealing your home as best you could, trying to create a tiny, sterile bubble in a city consumed by contagion. This wasn't a choice driven by selfishness, but by a desperate, cold logic of self-preservation. But this isolation came at a profound cost. If you or a member of your immediate family fell ill, there would be no one to turn to, no neighbors to bring water, no friends to sit by your side. You would become both patient and caregiver, wrestling with the terrifying symptoms of the disease while simultaneously trying to manage your own fear and exhaustion. The silence in your home, once a comfort, would become deafening, punctuated only by the sounds of suffering or the quiet. Terrifying knowledge that you were utterly alone in this battle. Thucydides noted this chilling phenomenon. The reason why men became indifferent to every rule of religion or law was that they saw the swift turn of fortune, by which rich men suddenly died and poor men inherited their wealth, and therefore indulged in every pleasure they could, because they knew that their lives were uncertain. This pursuit of immediate gratification by some was intertwined with the abandonment of the sick by others, leading to widespread loneliness and neglect for the afflicted. You were more likely to survive if you were young and strong enough to ride out the illness alone, or if you had family members willing to risk everything for you. For those who survived the initial onslaught due to some unknown immunity, perhaps they'd been exposed before in a mild form, or possessed some genetic resistance. Though the ancients wouldn't have understood this, their experience of isolation was different. They might become the reluctant caregivers, feeling a grim duty to tend to others, knowing they were less likely to succumb. But even then, the constant exposure to death and suffering, combined with the social breakdown, would leave them profoundly traumatized and isolated, burdened by the memories of those they couldn't save. One common historical misconception is that ancient quarantines were rigorously enforced in the same way as modern ones, while communities might try to isolate the sick. The sheer scale of the Plague of Athens, combined with the forced overcrowding within the city walls due to the war, made effective widespread quarantine almost impossible. Individual isolation, born of fear, was often a personal strategy rather than a public health mandate. Historians still debate the effectiveness of various ancient attempts at isolation and how it differed across city-states during different epidemics, often relying on indirect evidence from legal and medical texts. The irony of this forced isolation was that the very act of seeking safety, of retreating from communal life, further eroded the societal bonds that were so crucial to Greek identity. The concept of the polis, the close-knit city-state, was deeply intertwined with social interaction and civic duty. The plague, by forcing isolation, attacked the very soul of Athenian communal life, leaving survivors to grapple with not just the trauma of illness, but the profound loneliness of a shattered society. So, as you isolated yourself within your meager home, trying to shield yourself from the contagion, you experienced the horrifying irony of the Plague of Athens. Your best chance of survival lay in profound loneliness, in severing the very social ties that once defined your existence. This forced isolation, a desperate act of self-preservation, left an indelible mark on your spirit, making the experience of survival a grim, solitary triumph. As you continue your desperate struggle for survival amidst the terrifying chaos of the Plague of Athens, a new insidious layer of horror emerges: the crippling scarcity of essential supplies. Forget well-stocked pharmacies or clean water delivery. In a besieged, disease-ridden city, even the most basic necessities became impossibly rare and dangerous to acquire, making your survival attempt even more horrifying. Imagine the basic human needs: food and fresh water. The Spartans outside the long walls meant that no new provisions could enter Athens by land. The city relied entirely on sea trade through its port, Piraeus. But with the plague rampant, trade would inevitably slow, and fear would deter merchants, even if goods arrived. The sheer overcrowding within the walls meant that demand far outstripped supply. You might find prices skyrocketing for even a meager loaf of bread or a small skin of wine. Hunger, already a concern in normal times, would become a gnawing, constant companion. It truly sucked to be hungry and thirsty in a plague. Access to clean water was perhaps the most critical challenge. We've discussed how the public fountains and wells, once vital, became vectors for disease. Even if you dared to venture out to collect water, you'd face throngs of desperate, often sick, people, making every trip a deadly gamble. The water itself would be suspect, potentially teeming with the very pathogens that were killing your neighbors. Imagine the agonizing choice-risk infection to quench your thirst, or suffer the dehydrating torment of the plague's fever. Then there was the desperate need for medicine and basic care items. Of course, there were no antibiotics or advanced pharmaceuticals. The ancient Greek physicians, as noted, were largely helpless, but even simple herbal remedies, clean bandages, or fresh linens would become scarce. Those few who still had supplies might hoard them, or sell them at extortionate prices, creating a black market where survival literally cost a fortune. If you were poor, your chances were practically nil. Consider the desperate lengths people would go to acquire these necessities. Thucydides, our primary source, describes how such was the violence of the plague that men, having no hope of saving themselves, became reckless of human law and all sacred things. This indifference led to widespread looting and plunder. People would break into the homes of the sick and dead, not just for valuables, but for any food, water, or cloth they could find. You might be forced to steal, or to defend your meager possessions with your life. Against desperate and infected individuals, the city was a free-for-all, where basic survival trumped all morality. The lack of sanitation compounded the crisis. With waste disposal systems overwhelmed and bodies piling up, the very air became a source of contagion. Imagine the stench, the flies, the pervasive filth that surrounded you. This created a terrible feedback loop. Scarcity of water meant less washing, which led to more filth, which bred more disease. You were trapped in an increasingly unsanitary environment with no means to escape or truly clean yourself. One common historical misconception is that ancient siege conditions always led to such extreme material shortages. While sieges certainly caused hardship, the specific combination of overcrowding and a novel, virulent disease is what made the Athenian situation uniquely catastrophic. The plague, rather than the Spartans, was the true enemy within the walls, transforming ordinary shortages into a death sentence. Historians still meticulously study the logistical challenges of ancient sieges and how unexpected variables, like epidemics, could completely alter their outcome. Furthermore, the breakdown of social structures meant that traditional forms of communal support for the sick and needy largely vanished. There were no organized relief efforts, no public health initiatives. Every family, every individual was on their own. If your household ran out of supplies and you had no one willing to risk contact, your fate was sealed. The market for basic goods would disappear, replaced by desperate hoarding and opportunistic theft. So, as you struggled to survive the Plague of Athens, the horrifying scarcity of essential supplies became a constant, agonizing torment. Every drop of water, every morsel of food, every clean cloth was a precious commodity, fought for amidst overwhelming fear and rampant lawlessness. This profound lack of basic necessities, coupled with the disease itself, transformed Athens into a living hell, where survival was a desperate individualistic struggle against an omnipresent, invisible enemy. As the plague finally began to recede, leaving behind a city scarred by death and despair, you, as one of the fortunate few who had endured its horrifying embrace, would grapple with a profound question: how did you survive? Was it some innate immunity, a stroke of unimaginable luck, or a combination of factors that allowed you to emerge from the shadow of death? This lingering uncertainty, coupled with the grim reality of a changed world, made your survival a complex and deeply horrifying experience in itself. Imagine the first morning where the silence feels different, not the oppressive silence of death, but a fragile, hesitant quiet. The cries of the sick diminish. The constant procession of bodies slows. A faint, almost forgotten sound of a bird chirping might reach your ears. You step outside your home, cautiously, and the air, though still heavy with the lingering scent of decay, feels less suffocating. The immediate, visceral terror begins to recede, replaced by a weary exhaustion and a chilling sense of emptiness. It truly sucked to be alive when so many weren't. For those who survived, the experience was deeply varied. Some, like Thucydides himself, contracted the disease, suffered through its agonizing symptoms, and against all odds, recovered. Their bodies bore the scars, perhaps a lingering weakness, memory loss, or even the loss of fingers or toes due to gangrene. These survivors carried the physical proof of their ordeal, a constant reminder of how close they came to death. Their survival was a testament to their body's inexplicable ability to fight off a merciless pathogen. Then there were those, like you, who might have been exposed repeatedly, lived in the heart of the contagion, yet never seemed to develop the full-blown, fatal symptoms. Perhaps you experienced a milder form of the illness, mistaking it for a common fever, or perhaps your body mounted an effective, asymptomatic defense. This group of survivors would be left with a haunting question: were you truly immune, or just incredibly, impossibly lucky? This uncertainty would weigh heavily on your mind, making every cough, every slight headache, a source of renewed anxiety. The concept of immunity, as we understand it today, was entirely unknown in ancient Greece. They had no knowledge of antibodies, viruses, or bacteria. If you survived, it was attributed to divine favor, a strong constitution, or perhaps the efficacy of some desperate, unproven remedy. There was no scientific explanation, no comforting knowledge that your body had built defenses. This lack of understanding meant that survivors lived with a perpetual fear of recurrence, never truly knowing if they were safe. Thucydides noted a crucial observation about survivors. The most striking peculiarity was that those who recovered from the disease had no fear for themselves and were ready to minister to the sick, since they had learned by experience that they could not be attacked a second time. This is a fascinating historical detail that strongly suggests some form of acquired immunity. Those who had recovered seemed to possess a newfound courage, a willingness to help others, because they believed they were safe from reinfection. Imagine the psychological relief of that realization, even in the midst of such devastation. This newfound immunity, however, came at the terrible price of having endured the plague's full fury. This observation by Thucydides is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the Plague of Athens, whatever its true identity, conferred lasting immunity on its survivors. This is a common historical fact now. Often used by epidemiologists to analyze ancient outbreaks, it implies that the pathogen was likely a virus or bacterium that triggered a robust immune response, rather than something like a toxin that wouldn't lead to long-term protection. However, this immunity was not universal. Some individuals, particularly those who were already weakened by other ailments or chronic malnutrition, a common issue for many in ancient societies, might have been more susceptible. The elderly and the very young were often the first to succumb, their immune systems less robust. So while immunity was a factor, it was likely intertwined with the individual's overall health, genetic predispositions, and perhaps even the specific viral load they encountered. The psychological burden of survival was immense. You had witnessed horrors that would haunt your dreams for years to come: the mass graves, the abandoned sick, the breakdown of law and order. These images would be seared into your memory. You would carry the guilt of survival, the question of why me when so many others, perhaps more virtuous or beloved, had perished. This survivor's guilt would be a heavy cloak, wrapping you in a quiet melancholy. Furthermore, the social landscape had been irrevocably altered. Friends, family members, neighbors, many were gone. The city itself, though slowly rebuilding, felt different, emptier. The communal bonds had been stretched to breaking point, and while some might be reforged, others would remain permanently fractured. You would live in a world populated by ghosts, constantly reminded of what had been lost. One unique detail about the aftermath of the plague, often overlooked, is the impact on Athenian demographics and power dynamics. The plague disproportionately affected the crowded lower classes and the urban poor. but it also claimed many prominent citizens, including Pericles himself, the great statesman. This loss of leadership and a significant portion of the population would have had profound long-term effects on Athens' military strength, its political stability, and its cultural output. Imagine the power vacuum, the scramble for new leadership, and the loss of accumulated knowledge and skill that would follow. This demographic shift, a direct consequence of the plague, contributed to Athens' eventual defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The question of whether survivors were truly immune or simply lucky remains a subject of ongoing academic debate among historians and epidemiologists, while Thucydides' account strongly suggests acquired immunity. The precise nature of the pathogen and the individual variations in human response mean that a definitive blanket statement is difficult. Some scholars argue that while immunity was likely, factors like exposure dose, individual health at the time of infection, and even psychological resilience played a significant role in determining who lived and who died. The complexity of ancient epidemics often leaves room for such nuanced interpretations. So, as you emerged from the shadow of the Plague of Athens, your survival was a complex tapestry of physical endurance, perhaps a biological advantage, and an undeniable element of sheer, terrifying luck. But it was a survival that came at a profound cost, leaving you with physical scars, psychological trauma, and a permanent sense of living in a world irrevocably changed by the horrors you had witnessed. As you stand amidst the ruins of a city ravaged by plague, having perhaps miraculously survived the horrors, your attention would turn to the long, arduous process of recovery and rebuilding. This wasn't a quick bounce back. It was a desperate, generational struggle to restore a semblance of normalcy, haunted by the ghosts of the lost and shaped by the bitter lessons of the plague. This slow, painful return to life made your survival a deeply horrifying experience. As you bore witness to the city's agonizing convalescence, imagine the sheer scale of the task. So many dead, so many homes abandoned, so many fields left untended. The population of Athens, once a vibrant polis teeming with life, had been drastically reduced. Estimates vary, but a significant portion, perhaps a quarter to a third, or even more, of its inhabitants had perished. This meant a severe labor shortage. Who would farm the land? Who would man the workshops? Who would row the triremes that were the backbone of Athenian naval power? Every aspect of civic life had been decapitated, and rebuilding meant doing so with far fewer hands. It truly sucked to be a survivor in a city of ghosts. The economic impact was catastrophic. Trade routes were disrupted. Foreign markets hesitant to deal with a plague-stricken city. Agriculture, already strained by the war and the forced relocation of farmers within the walls, would suffer immensely. The wealth of the city, once so formidable, had been squandered on futile medical efforts, emergency burials, and simply the cost of survival. Rebuilding the economy would be a slow, painstaking process requiring decades, not years. You would live in a city grappling with widespread poverty and scarcity, trying to mend its broken economic back. Beyond the practical, there was the profound social and psychological scarring, the moral breakdown witnessed during the plague, the abandonment of loved ones, the rampant lawlessness. These memories would linger like a toxic miasma. Trust, once a cornerstone of Athenian society, would be severely eroded. How do you rebuild community when people remember who abandoned whom? How do you restore faith in law when it was so easily disregarded? The fabric of society, once tightly woven, was now frayed and loose, perhaps permanently. The loss of intellectual and artistic talent would also be a heavy burden. The plague claimed not just common citizens, but poets, philosophers, artisans, and skilled craftsmen. Imagine the loss of knowledge, of cultural memory, of potential innovations that simply vanished with their lives. The golden age of Athens, in many respects, was abruptly curtailed by the plague. Its future generations deprived of the wisdom and creativity that would have flowed from those who perished. This was an unquantifiable, yet profound horror. One common historical misconception is that ancient societies simply moved on quickly from such devastating events. While life did eventually resume, the psychological and demographic scars of a major plague would linger for generations. Oral traditions and written accounts would ensure that the memory of the plague and its horrors was passed down, shaping cultural attitudes towards disease, death, and social order for centuries to come. Historians still meticulously study these long-term demographic and cultural shifts to understand the true resilience and fragility of ancient civilizations in the face of widespread catastrophe. Furthermore, the political ramifications were immense. Athens' military strength, particularly its manpower, was severely depleted. Its allies, seeing its weakness, might grow restless or even defect. The Peloponnesian War continued to rage, and Athens, weakened by its internal struggle, would find itself at a distinct disadvantage against its Spartan rivals. The plague didn't just kill people, it played a decisive role in the ultimate outcome of the war, contributing to Athens' eventual defeat. Your survival, therefore, was tied to the decline of your once mighty city. The survivors themselves would carry a unique burden. While some might have gained immunity, as Thucydides observed, they also carried the psychological scars of witnessing such widespread death and the moral degradation of their society. They were the living testament to the horror, forever changed by what they had endured. This made the act of rebuilding not just a physical effort, but a profound psychological one, as they tried to make sense of the senseless and find meaning in the chaos. So, as you emerged from the shadow of the Plague of Athens, your survival was not an end to the horrifying experience, but merely a transition to a new phase of profound struggle. You would live in a city slowly, painfully, trying to heal its wounds, burdened by loss, scarcity, and a shattered sense of order. The long process of rebuilding made your survival a continuous, deeply horrifying encounter with the plague's lasting legacy, a testament to the profound, transformative power of disease on civilization. You've witnessed the horrifying onset, the brutal symptoms, the collapse of order, and the long, agonizing aftermath of the Plague of Athens as the final echoes of suffering fade and the imagined stench of death slowly dissipates from your senses. A profound, lingering truth settles upon you. The horrifying Plague of Athens wasn't just a historical event. It was a transformative cataclysm that irrevocably altered the course of a civilization, leaving lessons etched in the very stones of the city and the souls of its survivors. Consider the fragility of life and society. Before the plague, Athens was a vibrant, confident city-state at the height of its power and intellectual prowess. Yet, in the face of an unseen enemy, its sophisticated systems of governance, its revered medical knowledge, and even the cherished bonds of family and faith crumbled with terrifying speed. This brutal demonstration of human vulnerability in the face of a relentless pathogen is a chilling reminder of how quickly order can descend into chaos and how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. Then there's the unmasking of human nature, Thucydides' vivid account, which has guided our journey, painted a grim picture of despair leading to lawlessness, self-interest trumping compassion, and the abandonment of the sick. While horrifying, it also offered a stark, uncomfortable mirror reflecting humanity's darker impulses when pushed to the absolute brink. Yet amidst this depravity, glimmers of nobility persisted, with some selfless individuals risking their lives to care for others. Highlighting the complex, contradictory nature of humanity in crisis, the limits of ancient knowledge were brutally exposed. Despite their philosophical brilliance and advancements in other fields, the Greeks were utterly helpless against the plague. Their medical theories, based on humors and observation, offered no cure, only ineffective and sometimes harmful interventions. This profound medical impotence underscored the vast gulf between their understanding and the biological realities of contagion. A humbling lesson about the boundaries of human knowledge in the face of nature's raw power. And finally, the lasting legacy of trauma and change. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed an era. It decimated Athens' population, crippled its military, and arguably contributed to its eventual defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The survivors carried the physical scars, the psychological wounds of witnessing unimaginable suffering, and the burden of rebuilding a shattered society. The city that emerged from the plague was forever changed, its golden age tarnished by the grim reality of its mortality. Your survival, therefore, was not merely personal. It was a testament to enduring a profound societal wound. One common misconception, often romanticized in popular culture, is that ancient plagues somehow purified society or led to a spiritual awakening. While some may have turned to religion, Thucydides' account directly contradicts this, showing a profound loss of faith and moral decay. The plague led to chaos and despair, not necessarily spiritual enlightenment. Historians still meticulously study these socio-cultural impacts, analyzing how such devastating events influence subsequent political thought, religious practices, and artistic expression, recognizing that the long-term consequences are often more complex and nuanced than simple purification. Ultimately, the story of how you survived a horrifying plague in ancient Greece is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. But it is also a chilling narrative of what happens when humanity is stripped bare, when science is powerless, and when the very foundations of society begin to crack. The horrifying lessons of Athens' plague serve as a timeless, stark reminder of the devastating power of disease and the enduring, yet fragile, nature of human civilization. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the sounds of suffering and the stench of ancient death fade into the realm of history. You are safe now, far removed from the terror and despair of plague-stricken Athens. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of health and security, a contrast to the horrifying truth we've explored tonight. You've completed your stark journey through the horrifying plague in ancient Greece, and as the lingering echoes of suffering and the faint, phantom stench of ancient death finally dissipate, a chilling, profound truth settles in. The Plague of Athens wasn't just a historical footnote or a distant tragedy. It was a cataclysm that ripped through the very soul of a proud civilization, leaving indelible scars on its survivors and forever reshaping its destiny. Think about the sheer overwhelm you experienced, from the rapid onset of agonizing symptoms that defied all medical knowledge, to the horrifying sight of mass burials stripping dignity from the dead, to the complete collapse of law, order, and even basic human compassion. Your senses were assaulted, your morality tested, and your very understanding of society was shattered. It was an apocalyptic vision made real, a testament to how fragile the constructs of civilization truly are when faced with an existential biological threat. Then consider the psychological torment, the pervasive fear, the chilling desensitization to death, the agonizing despair that made many simply give up the will to live. Even if your body survived, your mind was irrevocably scarred by the trauma of witnessing such widespread suffering and the moral decay of your fellow citizens. The trust, once a cornerstone of Athenian life, was deeply eroded, leaving a society fractured and wary. And what about the brutal lessons learned, or perhaps not learned? The helplessness of ancient medicine in the face of a novel pathogen, forcing people to rely on luck or unproven remedies, the desperate scarcity of basic supplies in an overcrowded, besieged city, turning everyday necessities into objects of desperate plunder. These were not just inconveniences, they were active contributors to the death toll and the overall horror of the experience. Ultimately, your survival, if you were one of the fortunate few, was a complex tapestry woven from physical resilience, perhaps some genetic predisposition to immunity, and an undeniable, terrifying stroke of luck. But it was a survival burdened by immense loss, the profound guilt of being alive when so many perished, and the daunting task of rebuilding a world that had been fundamentally broken. The golden age of Athens was undeniably tarnished, its trajectory altered by this brutal visitation of disease. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the sounds of ancient Athens, once vibrant and now hushed by tragedy, fade into the quiet background of history. You are safe, in your own time, far removed from the terror, despair, and the horrifying truths of ancient plagues. May your dreams be peaceful, undisturbed by the echoes of that unimaginable suffering, and may you rest in the quiet certainty of modern health and security, a stark contrast to the world we explored tonight. And now, good night, and have sweet dream. And